December 6, 1941, south of Moscow, the birch woods around Tula burned white with hoarfrost as the dawn crawled over a horizon made of ice. Breath turned to needles. In a shallow trench along the edge of a frozen field, men of Germany's 2nd Panzer Army cupped blackened hands around mug, lids, and candle stubs, watching the engine crews coax reluctant Maybachs to life by torching oil pans beneath thin, bellied Panzer RFEs. Metal groaned like an animal. The temperature had fallen past 30°C in the night, and every moving part, carabiner 98K bolts, MG34 feed trays, the fingers that fed them, had stiffened into brittle refusals. Nothing wanted to wake. 2 months earlier, when the mud of the Rasputitsa swallowed boots and axles, and Soviet prisoners shuffled by in quilted telegraki, Fur-Ashanki pulled low, and felt Valenki rising like stovepipes, someone in the lead element had laughed and called them scarecrow coats fit only for peasants. They do not laugh now, Heinz Guderian had written. My troops are at the end of their strength. The words thin and flat on a page that could not relay the H in the knuckles or the skin split, raw by the cold. Exhaustion had a sound. Across the field, shapes in white camouflage smocks moved with a patient, winter, bread economy, skis whispering, sledges hissing. The smell of stove, wood and felt rising from dugouts cut clean into the earth and lined with fresh pine. The Red Army had prepared. Their gear, Telegraka padded jackets that trapped heat like a second skin, Portianki foot wraps dried against tin stoves, heavy sheepskin shubi and stubborn Valenki felt boots, looked heavy and crude at a distance, yet in air that sliced through leather Marschekstiefel and knit socks, crude meant life. Function was victory. German orders from the previous week had advised keeping weapons, bone, dry, greases wiped with petrol, bolts polished bare, and to insulate boots with straw or newspaper when the felt insoles failed. A fieldcraft gleaned not from manuals, but from the enemy they had underestimated. Pride had a price. Gefrita Lange rapped his Mauser's bolt with a gloved knuckle, heard the cracked note of frozen steel, and breathed into the chamber until his lips went numb, while down the line the company runner tried to light a wick inside a tin filled with rifle oil that had become the colour and consistency of amber. The flame crawled and died. Beyond the hedgerow, a white flare rose and began to drift, and for a long 5 seconds the frost glittered with a million tiny mirrors in its light, each one catching a piece of every soldier's breath and fear. The night was beautiful. It was also the moment everything they believed about the enemy's winter broke, because the counterblow was moving, because the men in the white smocks were not freezing, and because the German advance, so smooth in September, was now a line of shivering shadows rooted by cold to the wrong country. Momentum had frozen. At company headquarters, a field phone crackled an order to hold until first light, but the copper wire had turned rigid, and the handset clacked with a hollow ring, and the only clear sound in the trench was the dry squeal of wool over wool. As men tried to flex feet, they could scarcely feel. Frostbite had arrived before the reserves. When the first mortar rounds began to fall, the shock lifted clods that flew like china, and the air filled with the metallic, sweet smell of explosive in cold air, a strange, almost clean scent that made men blink tears that froze at once along their lashes. Tears turned to glass. A corporal pulled a Soviet greatcoat from a captured pile and dragged it over his shoulders. The sheepskin thick with smoke and sweat, and for the first time that winter he understood why the men in red stars had wrapped themselves so. Humility warmed better than hatred. By noon, the sun sat pale and unconvincing above a landscape of frost, rimed wire and stiffened bodies, and the advance that had promised Moscow now measured itself in the distance between a candle's heat and a man's cracked fingers. The offensive was gone. In the unforgiving sky of that day, as flesh failed and machines sulked, the joke about the Russians' winter gear withered into silence, and the march east became a slow fight against a white enemy older than war. Mockery had met the cold. Operation Barbarossa opened on the 25th of June 1941 with more than 3 million Axis soldiers driving east in 3 great wedges toward Leningrad, Moscow and Ukraine, their columns threaded with over 3,000 tanks and a sky choked by Luftwaffe formations. Confidence rode ahead of the lead elements. Army Group Center, commanded by Feder von Bock, bore the spear pointed at Moscow, with Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 and Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group 2 redesignated 2nd Panzer Army on the 5th of October 1941, racing past shattered Soviet lines towards Smolensk and beyond. The pace felt unstoppable. In July and August, the encirclements at Minsk and Smolensk seemed to prove the thesis that the Red Army was brittle, confused, and doomed to collapse under shock and speed. Arrogance took root. Then logistics, rails, roads, fuel, food, and clothing, began to drag like anchors. Soviet broad gauge tracks had to be converted, truck fleets burned out on dust, and then drowned in the autumn Rasputitsa. And every kilometre away from Warsaw or Königsberg stretched supply to a fraying thread. The machine outpaced its blood. High Command still believed the campaign would conclude before serious winter, and German infantry advanced in light wool tunics and greatcoats, hobnailed Marschstiefel and knit socks, with winter issue queued in depots hundreds of miles behind. Calendars lied in the cold. On the 2nd of October 1941, Operation Typhoon lunged for the capital, crushing pockets at Vyazma and Bryansk, and sending prisoners stumbling west by the tens of thousands. The road to Moscow, on maps, looked open. Maps do not feel weather. The Red Army, however, did not shatter, it bent, absorbed, and thickened around the city under Georgy Zhukov, who staged layers of defence from Mozhaysk to the factory districts, and began to feed in fresh, winter-hardened formations. Some redeployed from Siberia when intelligence showed Japan would not strike the Far East. Reserves gathered in the snow. To the south of Moscow, the city of Tula became a hinge. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army sought to swing past it and roll the capital from below, while General Ivan Bolden's 50th Army and workers' militias dug in, fought from street to street, and refused the door. The hinge did not turn. Here the contrast in winter doctrine. Sharpened Soviet troops wore telegrapher quilted jackets, sheepskin shubi, Ushanki pulled low, and Valenki felt boots over Portianki foot wraps, their platoons living in dug, in Zemlyanki warmed by little iron stoves. German companies bivouacked shallow in wind, cut trenches, greatcoats stiffening, candles guttering, and leather boots wicking cold straight into bone. Clothing became strategy. In weapons and engines the same gap appeared, Soviet rifles and the DP light machine gun with looser tolerances, and vehicles like the T-34 with wide tracks and a Torquay V2 diesel, endured mud and frost better than MG-34s with finely machined internals and Panzer IV running gear on narrower tracks, especially before Winterketten. Extensions and low temperature lubricants reached the front. Precision turned fragile. German doctrine acknowledged cold in memoranda only after it arrived, ordering bolts to be kept bone, dry, radiators drained nightly to prevent cracked blocks, and boots insulated with straw or newspaper when issue felt inserts ran out, while quartermasters queued winter parkas that were still days or weeks away by rail. Improvisation replaced planning. On the Soviet side, ski detachments and scouts in white smocks slipped through birch and pine at night, bringing back positions and prisoners, and artillery registered on frozen fields that carried sound like glass. Behind them, factories east of the Urals pushed rifles, shells, and simple, warm clothing to the front in an unromantic rhythm. Utility beat elegance. By mid-November, the first sharp frosts scoured away the mud. What remained was iron air, brittle steel, and flesh that failed without warning, and in staff diaries a new tone surfaced alongside map arrows and daily tallies. Doubt crept in with the cold. Heinz Guderian wrote, "My troops are at the end of their strength." A flat line that concealed how engine oil congealed like honey, and a man's feet could lose feeling before first light and never find it again. Endurance, not elan, would decide. Zhukov, measuring the strain on both sides, aligned the Kalinin western and southwestern fronts for a timed counterstroke once the freeze held, confident that the enemy had outrun his logistics and his clothing. He would let the cold be a partner. In company messes and motor pools, the cultural disdain that had mocked felt boots and fur caps in September became a private embarrassment, as battalions quietly issued captured Soviet sheepskins and white camouflage from field depots marked Butte booty, while men learned to wrap feet and dry them against stovepipe heat. Necessity taught humility. What mattered now was not only who had more tanks or guns, but whose doctrine recognized that winter was an operating environment, as real as armor thickness or road speed, and whose soldiers had been taught to live inside it as naturally as they fired and marched. The season became a weapon. As the calendar ticked toward early December, Army Group Center's tip stood spent outside the city it had sworn to seize. And the Red Army, dressed for its own country, supplied by depth, commanded by a man who understood tempo, set its shoulder to the counterblow. The setup was complete, and the sky smelled of frost and cordite. Winter in 1941 was not a backdrop but a system, and every component, cloth, steel, oil, and doctrine, either harmonized with it or failed against it. Compatibility was survival. Soviet issue looked rustic. Telegreka quilted jackets packed with cotton batting, shubi of sheepskin, wishanki with fur, lined ear flaps, and valenki felt boots wrapped over portyanki footcloths dried nightly on hot iron stoves. Crude meant warm. The German field kit was elegant for autumn. M36 IM40 wool tunic, long greatcoat, leather Marschstiefel with hobnails, knit socks. But the leather wicket moisture and the hobnails conducted the cold straight into bone. Elegance bled heat. Soviet snow smocks erased outlines against birch and field, while Zemlyanki dugouts, roofed with logs and sod, kept a steady glow from pot-bellied stoves that doubled as drying racks for foot wraps and mittens. Shelter became a weapon. German positions were shallow, wind, bitten trenches with candles for heat and gasoline, soaked rags for light, and the frost climbed into sleeves and cuffs and stayed there. The cold did not retreat. Weapons revealed the same design philosophy. The Red Army leaned on the Mosint-Nagant 91-30A and Degtyaryov's DP-27. Their looser tolerances forgiving ice, grit, and crude, dry lubrication. Ruggedness paid. The Wehrmacht's MG-34 was a masterpiece. Air-cooled, 7.9 2057 Lm, with finely machined internals and a blistering rate of fire. But its precision demanded the right oil, the right temperature, the right touch. Perfection turned fragile. German directives for the frost advised stripping bolts clean and running them bone, dry, keeping feed trays immaculate, and warming receivers undercoats before an attack, while Soviet manuals had long recommended spindle oils and kerosene for winter degreasing. Experience wrote doctrine. Even the sound was different. The DP-27's measured clatter kept going with snow crusting its pan, while the MG-34's rhythm stuttered when congealed lubricants turned silky steel into sandpaper. Music broke in the cold. On the tank line, the T-34 was a winter bred creature, a 12.5-cylinder Velo-2 diesel delivering roughly 500 SP, wide tracks that spread weight and lowered ground pressure, and sloped armour that shed snow and shell alike. It breathed in frost, Against it the Panzer, Thura and IV came with Maybach HL 120 engines near 300 HP. Narrower tracks and higher ground pressure. Before Winterketten extensions arrived, they dug and spun where the TT-34 crawled and climbed. Traction decided fate. German drivers learned by hard lesson to drain radiators at night to prevent cracked blocks and to warm oil with blow lamps under the sump at dawn, while Soviet crews lit braziers beneath hulls and treated the VL-2 like a stubborn but loyal horse. Starting was a ritual. Engine oil had a pour point, and men could smell when it failed. It went from fluid to honey to glass, and the Maybach's complaint became a grinding whine that said, "Not today." Mechanics heard despair. Infantry doctrine met climate in the close fight. German platoons built around riflemen with an MG-34 base of fire depended on fluid suppression and manoeuvre, but frost, stiff fingers, jamming belts, and short daylight hours throttled that tempo. Tactics froze. Soviet units leaned into range and rhythm. PPS-41 submachine guns with 900 RPM bursts and thick gloves at 50 meters, DP-27s covering in steady arcs, and ski detachments slipping through tree lines to cut wire and seize crossroads under a white moon. Proximity killed. Artillery, too, obeyed winter physics. Sound travelled farther over frozen ground, registration held crisply, and the Red Army's 76.2 Mummensen field guns, towed by horses or sledges, arrived where trucks floundered. Steel rode on hooves. Communications carried the season's signature. German field phone lines turned brittle. Switchboards crackled with frost, and radios lost range as batteries died in the cold, while Soviet runners skied messages and sergeants read orders by the stove's orange eye. Voices shortened. Supply was a doctrine in itself. German depots sat far down a rail, net still being regouged. Truck columns burned out before Smolensk. And quartermasters pleaded for parkas that were days too late. But the Soviets pulled from factories moved beyond the Volga and sent warmth as seriously as ammunition. Depth mattered. Mein Truppen signed am Ende a rare crafty. Heinz Guderian recorded in early December, a sentence born of mechanics as much as morale, of engines that would not turn and boots that would not warm. Strength had limits. In the staff maps, blue arrows still pressed toward Moscow, but the machine behind those arrows, the oils and steels, the gears and cloth, was misaligned with the sky it crossed. Misfit meant failure. The Red Army's winter kit and methods, tested in climate and codified in practice, fit the weather like a key fits a lock, and when the door opened, it did so with the soft wooden creak of a Zemlyanka hatch at dawn. Function outlived pride, and in that fit, the breath of a diesel at Mai 30, the whisper of skis over crust, the thud of felt on packed snow. The character of the machine revealed itself as more than metal, more than cloth, more than doctrine. It was a living rhythm you could hear in the cold. Before dawn on the 6th of December 1941, south of Tula, the snow had a crust that sang under boots, and the sky held its breath, while men in white smocks slid between birch trunks toward a road post marked by a frozen opal blitz and a tangle of wire. Silence sharpened the fear. The German outpost was a sketch in frost. One MG-34 on a bipod under a canvas stiff as tin, two rifles propped against a plank. A field phone line that bent like glass when touched, and in the slit trench a sentry tried to work a bolt that would not move. Mechanisms betrayed flesh. Across the field, Soviet sappers in padded telegraki crept to the wire with long-handled cutters, their breath a faint smoke in the white, while behind them ski infantry of the 50th Army waited, poles planted, listening for the first cough of artillery. Patience wore white. At 06:10, 376.2 Mummen rounds bracketed the road in neatly walked pairs, and the snow lifted in light, perfect cones that settled soft as ash on the truck's hood. The world thumped once. In the trench, A Jeffriter slapped the feed cover of the MG and shouted to warm the receiver under his coat, and the runner kicked at the field phone. Nothing. And then the line glowed with frost where it had snapped. Connections snapped with it. From the tree line, white smeared forward and became people. The hiss of skis, a dry whisper like sand, poured from a height, and a dark shape. T-34. Engine already warm from a brazier's worth of heat. Rolled out in a deliberate crouch, bow cutting a wake in the drift. Mass gained purpose. The German gunner, breath clawing at his throat, racked the cover again. The bolt skated and stuck. The belt reluctant. And when the trigger finally broke, the first burst came low and short, and then died in a stutter that sounded like a man biting his tongue. Precision froze at the moment of need. On the Soviet net, the company commander's voice was flat and close to the mic. Atakovat, Slaver, poshly, and the file fanned left, the smocks becoming shadows among birches, the smell of stove soot and wool moving with them like a travelling hearth. Warmth advanced against cold. A German NCO broke the latch on a crate of stick grenades with his rifle butt and stuffed 2 into his belt. And when he raised himself to throw, the first PPSH-41 burst found the top inch of the parapet and chewed it into splinters that fell like sawdust across his sleeve. Wood and wool shattered together. By 07 Hodra, the post was gone, and the road beyond it, the one that had fed the tip of 2nd Panzer Army, became a white alley held by men who did not need to stamp their feet to feel them. Habits decided ground. Behind the first line, German company reports recorded what the maps could not. MG-34 versagt BKELT, Duatrocken Halten. Zaulreich Erfrirungen. The paper sounded tired. At Guderian's headquarters, the morning situation report arrived with edges curled from the stove and arrows curved backward from Kashira and Venev. The Panzer General's own assessment, later written in his memoir, was a sentence distilled to metal. Mein Truppen signed amend ihre Kräfte. Adrenaline had run out. By mid-morning, the Western Front's counteroffensive had become an audible thing up and down Army Group Centre. North at Klin and Kalinin, south at Tula and the Oka Bens, the steady, chopping rhythm of Soviet guns and the sifting friction of skis on crust. A front turned from hunter to hunted. At noon, a regimental staff car slid into a ditch because the driver's hands could not hold the wheel. And when they hauled him out, his boots were 2 dark shapes connected to him only by habit. The medical officer touched his toes and did not bother to ask if he could feel it. Frostbite made the decisions. On the 8th of December, after 2 days of shock and recoil, Adolf Hitler issued the stand fast order. Halten, summed up by officers as Die Army have erlaubt, Wussi steht, a sentence that sounded like steel but felt like ice to men already stuck in place. Immobility became doctrine. In one platoon diary, written with a pencil that squeaked on a damp page, the entry for the day did not mention the enemy first. It listed the temperatures, the oil, the boots. The number of men sent rearward not for wounds, but because fingers gone white had turned to a wax the colour of old marble. The cold signed the roster. The Red Army's assault did not look like a parade. It looked like practical motion. Ski detachments slashing roads. Cavalry from the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps pushing through seams. Rifle divisions stepping on the crackled path left by T-34s, whose V-2 diesels beat like muffled drums under sheepskin covers. Utility turned to momentum. And in one of those short, compressed firefights at the edge of a village of low, smoking chimneys, the MG-34 finally sang properly, only to be silenced by a clean, square shell burst that left the tripod intact and the crew folded around it like coats thrown on a bench. Fortune had no warmth. By evening of the 3rd day, the Germans who had joked about Valenki and Arshanki were wearing captured ones, and still the reports rolled in. Frontlinie genommen, Frost den Nyman zu MG Klemt. The tone shifted from confidence to apology. What overturned assumptions was not a single heroic charge, but an accumulation of physics and planning. The Red Army dressed for its country, and moving to its calendar. The Wehrmacht clinging to fields it could not heat, ordered to hold when even standing still cost flesh. Reality arrived wearing felt. The shock at the post was the small version of a larger one unfolding on the map. And as the white smocks folded into the tree line again, the last thought that stayed with the men who survived was not of the enemy's numbers or courage. It was of the cold that chose sides. The counter-offensive rolled out of the tree lines like a slow white tide, and the first shock blurred into a steady rhythm of raids, cut roads, and dawns that began with the hiss of skis and the thud of felt. Routine became dread. In headquarters logs, staff officers drew shorter arrows and longer notes. Skis at night, cavalry pushing through seams, and Tito 34s idling behind berms with engines kept warm by braziers, their diesel breath visible in long, disciplined plumes. The cold had organization. German adaptation arrived as crates and orders. Their language a new grammar of survival. Winter lubricants, radiator antifreeze, snow chains, and the first bolted, Winterketten, extenders clamping onto Panzerreuther and IV tracks to claw at crusted snow. Traction replaced pride. Workshop stripped oils, wiped bolts bone dry, and labelled cans. Verkade Lautibetrieb, while quartermasters dragged captured sheepskins and whitewash camo to battalions that had laughed at them in September. Humility crossed the wire. From Berlin and Krakow, shipments of felt liners, mittens, and scarves trickled forward on a rail, net still being regouged. And men learned to wrap Portianki footcloths, the way their enemy did, drying them at night on iron stovepipe heat in holes, roofed with logs. Instruction sounded like surrender. Soviet units tuned their own machine for the long frost, ski battalions probed rivers. First Guards, cavalry corps slipped behind German corps boundaries toward Weismar, and rifle divisions rotated through Zemlyanki that steamed with breath and stove glow while white smocks dried in tidy rows. Endurance had a schedule. The Wehrmacht recorded the cost in stark, tabulated ink. Over 100 Zalosen frostbite casualties by the heart of that winter across the Eastern Front. The numbers outpacing some weeks of combat wounds. Cold did what bullets could not. Heinz Guderian, writing later of that season, did not romanticize the reason. Wir waren für einen Winterkrieg nicht gerüstet. Preparation was the missing weapon. On the roads, Opel Blitz trucks rattled on chains that screamed on ice, drivers warming carburetors with open flames, while pioneer detachments cut timber to line trenches and raise bunks off the killing floor of frozen earth. Improvisation carried a saw. In the gun pits, MG-34 teams learned to cradle receivers under greatcoats before the first burst and to drape tarps over feed trays. Across the line, DP gunners sat squat behind low berms and panned steadily, their pans frosting white and still turning. Practice rewrote reflex. Reports shifted tone from September's contempt to December's wary respect. Find Trajet Weis Tarnung. Bewegt sich auf Skiern. Infanteristich Z. And on the Soviet side, political officers wrote of men who had mastered the cold as another drill to be executed, not a miracle to be credited. The myth gave way to method. Behind the front, factories east of the Volga sent an industrial winter with the rifles. Telegraki, Ashanki Valenki in bundles marked by stencil and cord, part of the same supply chain that fed shells and bread to the offensive. Warmth arrived as logistics. The first, Ostketten, wide track sets appeared the next year, 550 mm of stamped steel to spread the weight of panzer hulls. a metal admission that the enemy's climate was as much an obstacle as his guns. Design bent to geography. Whitewash camouflage turned grey columns into pale ghosts, and German skiers, newly formed companion with borrowed poles and battered bindings, began to shadow the tree lines that had once belonged only to red patrols. Imitation shadowed respect. Still the fear accumulated in little Ways field phones that snapped like sugar glass, batteries that died between orders, and machine bolts that tore skin when touched without thinking, all while rumours raced that the white ones were already on the next road, and the next. Anxiety moved faster than trucks. At night, the sky sounded close, artillery bursts cracked sharper over frozen ground, and cavalry hooves drummed a hollow rhythm across drifted lanes as scouts slipped over outposts with knives, pistols, and a confidence born of habits that did not need warmth to work. Silence learned to kill. The German army dug deeper and learned to roof and seal, to run stovepipe through snow mounds and pitch tents inside log shells, while medics trudged blackening toes with a briskness that came from seeing too many of them. Discipline fought decay. Soviet formations, too, adapted to the long fight. They rotated ski detachments to keep knees fresh, kept braziers and spare oil with their TT-34s, and spread out supply by sledge so a broken truck was not a broken attack. Resilience got granular. Some days the white world itself seemed to fight, drifting into drifts that swallowed road signs and buried caches, and a thaw would come and freeze again, locking guns in sheaths of lacquered ice whose cracking sounded like distant rifle fire. Nature had its own tempo. Yet by January, the pattern was undeniable. What had begun as a shock became a campaign of learning for one army and a campaign of penance for the other. And even as winter kit finally clawed forward to the German front, the emotional line had already moved. Confidence had changed sides. The laughter from autumn had turned into careful, quiet movements. Men who watched their breath and their bearings while scanning for a flicker of white above a ditch line, because the enemy wore the season and the season hid the enemy. Fear wore a smock, and over it all rose a professional admiration that soldiers would admit only in billets. How the Red Army lived in the unforgiving sky of that winter, as if it had been built to their measure, and how gear once mocked had become the standard by which they gouged their own survival. Respect replaced denial. By mid-December 1941, the white fields west of Moscow no longer felt like contested ground, but like a domain ruled by men who moved and breathed in step with the frost, their lines advancing on sledges, skis, and the sure, footed tread of Valenki. The season picked a side. Klin fell back into Soviet hands in the second week. Kalinin followed in the third, and by New Year the Red Stars were up in Kaluga and pushing toward the Vyazma-Rzhev line. Liberated names stitched like coarse thread across the map. Momentum turned tangible. In those recaptured towns the same tableau repeated. Zemlyanki steaming with breath, white smocks drying by iron stoves, and rifle companies rotating forward while T-34s ticked and cooled beneath covers that smelled of wool and smoke. Warmth fueled movement. The Wehrmacht held under the stand, fast order, Hulten, an iron word on paper that froze in men's throats as temperatures knifed below -30°C. Weapons stuttered, and boots filled with a kind of pain that had nothing to do with courage. Orders could not heat blood. Soviet formations made winter an instrument. First Shock Army drove on the Klin-Solnechny-Gorsk axis. 16th Army ground forward north of the Moscow-Volga Canal, and General Pavel Bilov's First Guards Cavalry Corps slipped through seams, cutting roads where sled tracks were better than tire chains. Flexibility rode felt and hoarse. Each day the rhythm-hardened dawn ski raids to unhinge outposts, noon artillery chopped clean by frozen air, Afternoon pushes with peepish bursts close and fast, and nights spent tending stoves, drying Port Yankee, and setting braziers under V1002 diesel so the morning would obey. Routine became a weapon. German adaptation lagged by inches and hours. Winterketten bit the crust too late. Dry bolts worked with numbed fingers, and whitewash crawled over panzer hulls whose Maybachs still grumbled awake under blow lamps like reluctant beasts. Improvisation could not erase physics. Some numbers tell the shape of it better than any adjective. Between 6th of December and the end of January, the front west of Moscow bent back 100 to 250 kilometers. Towns like Klin mid-Decembered, Kalinin 16th of Decembered, and Kaluga a 30 December changed flags. And frostbite casualties in the Osthia climbed into six figures even before the thaw. Statistics sounded like teeth chattering. Field hospitals wrote it down in ink that froze in the pens Nibby, Frostcha, Den Nimenzu, Zarichi amputationen, alongside lists of grenades and bread rations, a bureaucratic register for a human cost that came in discoloured toes, and hands that would never close on a rifle again. The ledger had a smell of carbolic and cold iron. On the line, a German machine gunner lifted his MG-34 and felt the resinous drag of metal against metal until it ran, and across the same lane a DP Li-27 chattered a steady answer that did not pause when its pan frosted white. Mechanics drew boundaries around bravery. Soviet infantry, padded into telegraki that trapped heat like captured breath, closed the last 40 meters with a practiced economy that looked like inevitability. 3 strides, a fall, a burst. A sledge pushed up with extra drums and a kettle that steamed like a small heartbeat. Proximity punished doubt. Why were not equipped for a winter war? Heinz Guderian would write, the line a flat verdict on a landscape where the enemy's clothing and doctrine had become as decisive as any gun. Admissions can arrive too late. Above the trenches the air itself changed the fight. Sound travelled farther across frozen ground and made artillery feel omnipresent, and even the echo of a horse's hooves seemed to strike twice as hard off the snowpack at night. The sky amplified fear. The Red Army paid. 2. Men lost to frost in positions that stayed warm only within arm's reach of a stove, patrols swallowed by sudden ground blizzards, and whole companies stalled by exhaustion. Yet the losses bled into an offensive that kept its cadence because the little things had been taught and supplied. Resilience absorbed pain. A German divisional war diary noted on the 18th of December, terse and obedient to format, K. Lultil Lan, Winterbekleidung unvolstnendig. Find Graft in Wysan, sehr beweglich. Paper whispered what men already knew. By early January, Mosaisk would be back in Soviet hands, and the drive would slow against new German lines, stiffened by desperation and logs. The campaign culminating along the Vyazma Azhev arc, where ice and distance finally equalized advantages. Dominance met its own limits. But the psychological crest had already been crossed. The laughter that met Ashanki in September had thinned into silence, and the sight of white smocks at the field's edge now reached the gut faster than any shouted order. Fear learned a uniform. What gave the Red Army the sky of that winter? Its light, its sound, its breath, was not mystery but fit quilts over skin, felt over earth. Diesel over ceremony, doctrine over pride. The environment had chosen its masters. And as January's light lay pale over the ruined barns and steaming dugouts, even the wind seemed to carry a judgment, moving from the east with the hiss of skis and the soft thud of boots that had never pretended to be anything but warm. The winter belonged to them, and it took its due. Far behind the birch lines and frozen roads, the night shift in the Urals hummed under frost. Stiff roofs, hammers ringing in air so cold it carried every strike like a bell across the rail yard. This was power without poetry. between July and December 1941. The Soviet state uprooted industry on a scale that defied maps. Over 1,500 major factories torn from Kharkov, Leningrad, and Moscow's edge, and replanted at Nizhny Tagil, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and beyond, along with millions of workers and their families. Distance became armour. Plant no. 183 reassembled at Nizhny Tagil with jigs still smelling of cosmoline, while the Kirov works fused with Chelyabinsk to make Tankograd, a city that ate ore and spat welded hulls under a sky that burned with slag. A foundry replaced a front line. Output told the truth in numbers that did not shiver. TLA-34 production climbed from under 3,000 in 1941 to well over 12,000 in 1942 as lines simplified casting, standardized fittings, and trained welders by the thousand to lay beads that looked like rough corduroy and held like fate. Quantity smothered elegance. Textile combines from Ivanovo to Ufa shifted to war rhythm, benches stacked with cotton batting and fur, turning bolts of cloth into telegraki and ashanki by the 100,000 while village workshops pressed valenki, felt on wooden lasts. Warmth came off the loom. Rail schedules under the NKPS folded all this into motion. Blacked-out freight snaked east to west past snow, choked sidings. The guards' breath white as the steam seeping from couplers, each wagon stenciled with coats that might mean shells, jackets or boots. Tracks, beat time. Vyodlaya fronta, Vysiodlaya pobedy. Everything for the front. Everything for victory. Began to appear on banners over doors, where women in kerchiefs ran presses and lathes beside boys too young to shave, their shift whistles cutting the dawn like bugles. Slogans became muscle. Across the ice to the north, the first Arctic convoys slid into Arkhangelsk and Murmansk under low sun and long shadows, bringing crates of woolens, aviation fuel, and British tanks, Matildas and Valentines, whose silhouettes would fight beside T-34s in the snow outside Moscow. Help wore a foreign stamp. The Red Army's winter kit, once mocked, now arrived as predictably as bread bundles of telegraki, stacks of ashanki, rolls of portyanki, and sledges piled with felt boots issued in field depots like ammunition, the paperwork as crisp and spare as the air. Clothing was a commodity of war. Ammunition flowed behind it. 76.2 mm and shells came off lines in Yormash and Perm as fast as freight could be turned. Brass warm from the press, even when the windows filmed over in ice and breath fogged above the dies. Factories exhaled heat into winter. On the German side, the industrial graph was not a crest but a lag Winterbekleidung. Parkas, mittens, felt liners, had been budgeted for, if needed, and then needed all at once. Trickling forward along rails cracked by regouging and roads, held together by frozen mud and horse lines. Late is another word for lost. The Ostyr had rolled east with nearly 600, Zylos and horses in June. By December, hay and oats were strategic cargo, and hoofbeats hauled what gasoline could not warm, while trucks sat with hoods open to the blue flame of blow lamps nursing reluctant Maybachs. Animal heat kept an army alive. Diaries and divisional logs began to sound like inventory under duress. Winterbekleidung unvolst en dig, Versorgungswage Gester. Frostsch, den Niemann Zoo. The clipped German piling into a verdict that had little to do with courage and everything to do with distance and design. Paper admitted what faces hid. Even the cartridge belts recorded the imbalance. The DPL-27's stamped pans stacked in tidy towers beside stoves that dried mittens as a matter of routine, while German belts lay in crates stamped. Verkehrsultebetrieb, waiting for oils that arrived 2 days too late. Routine beat improvisation. Chelyabinsk's, Tankograd, welded KV hulls in bays where sparks fell like orange snow. Uralvagonzavad measured shifts not in hours but in hulls. And women with leather aprons chalked numbers onto turrets that would rumble west before the paint fully set. The line never slept. Behind Moscow's walls, workshops repaired peepish receivers and machined new bolt faces by lamp light, while mule-drawn sledges moved boxes of caps and primers to regimental dumps, and cooks lifted lids on kettles that smelled of buckwheat and smoke. Sustenance had a system. In the German rear, the reality of winter's arithmetic hardened into a soldier's private grim humour. A lost boot was not replaced. A broken stove meant frostbite. A jammed MG meant silence. Equipment failure equaled casualties. Reports from Army Group Centre in late December tallied frostbite alongside enemy action, and staffers underlined the line items twice before shoving them into folders warmed by the stove. Numbers learned to whisper pain. The longer the rails to the east, the shorter the patience in the west. Soviet trains arrived with shells, fuel, and felt, while German columns leaned on horses and candles, and the promise that the next shipment would be the one that caught up. Promises don't heat hands. That winter's edge, the one that cut in the trenches, had been forged far from the line, under raftered roofs and hoar-frosted windows, where presses bucked and welders' visors flashed, and where a nation learned to extinguish warmth in homes so it could ship it to the front in cloth and steel. Industry became a front, and when the padded jackets and diesel hulls reached the snowfields outside Moscow, they did not simply equip soldiers. They arrived as an avalanche of steel and cloth, the material shape of a decision to make the season serve. The factories had chosen a side, and the rails carried the verdict. When the thaw came and the tracks turned to brown rivers, they found white smocks snagged on wire and felt boots heavy with meltwater, relics of a season that had spoken louder than speeches. The silence of the fields felt earned. In staff histories and memoirs, the bravado that laughed at quilted coats gave way to lines written without ornaments. Franz Halder recorded early, "Why have underestimated the Russian colossus? At the beginning we reckoned with about 200 divisions. Now we have already counted 360 point. Underestimation had a ledger." Guderian's verdict landed like a stamp at the end of a long report. "Wir waren für einen Winterkrieg nicht ausgerüstet." And every amputated toe and stalled Maybach seemed to initial it again. Reality signed in frost. For the Red Army, the memory settled into textures more than rhetoric cotton, batting that kept heat, sheepskin that smelled of smoke, felt soles that muted footfalls, and iron stoves glowing like tame embers in dugouts roofed with saplings and snow. Warmth became identity. Museums would later place these things behind glass. Telegreka, Ashanka, Valenki, beside photographs of men whose breath fogged the lens, while in the next hall a T-34 sat angled on its tracks as if it had just crested a drift. Objects held their own weather. The myth that winter alone saved Moscow soon found its critics, and rightly so. Zhukov's planning, the Siberian reserves, the Ural factories, and a rifle company's patient drill mattered as much as the mercury. Cold was a partner, not a saviour. Even so, the first winter on the Eastern Front wrote a narrow truth across countless small surfaces. Bolts, soles, fingers, gears. That war is a negotiation with environment, and doctrine must be translated into cloth and oil before it speaks clearly. Fit decided fate. German adaptation in later seasons acknowledged the lesson in fabric and pattern reversible Parker's white to field grey, quilted liners, felt, filstiefel, and snow camouflage that blurred the outline that pride had once displayed. Imitation followed pain. Soviet practice hardened into tradition. Winter training meant foot wraps dried nightly, weapons degreased for the freeze, braziers beside VO2 diesels, and ski detachments treated not as exotic raiders, but as ordinary infantry with different feet. Normalcy freed energy. The casualty tables tell the cost with an accountant's chill. By January 1942, German medical services reported over 100,000 frostbite cases, a number large enough to change plans without firing a shot. Numbers can numb. Soviet losses in that season were also a currency paid. Men frozen on outpost duty, patrols erased by ground blizzards, units spent in attacks that stalled at dark, yet the system behind them kept sending warmth with the shells. Endurance shares its burden. In letters home, soldiers on both sides stopped describing landscapes and started describing temperatures, a shift from romance to measurement that made every hill a thermometer and every march an equation. Winter turned poets into clerks. What had been mocked as peasant gear became, in retrospect, a symbol of a nation's industrial pragmatism. Textiles, fur, felt, arriving as predictably as bread and issued with the same seriousness as ammunition. Utility found dignity. A German divisional diary's clipped line, Winterbekleidung unvolstnendig, sits beside a Soviet poster that shouts, "Wir dla fronta," and together they raid like a call and response across the rails. One voice promised, the other delivered. The smell that returns to memory is not heroic. Lamp oil, damp wool, hot iron pipe. And yet it is as much the scent of survival as cordite and diesel. A sensory footnote to every map arrow bent west. Survival had a smell. The camera of history lingers on faces under fur caps and hands wrapped in mittens, and it learns to see behind them the assembly lines that spun the thread and the doctrine that wrote the checklists. Human warmth had a supply chain. When veterans later spoke of that winter, their voices rarely rose. They talked about boots and stoves and straps that did not break, and the way a rifle's bolt moved on a morning when the air could shatter water. Memory chose concrete things. The lesson broadens if you let it. The most decisive weapon in a campaign may be a piece of clothing that fits its sky, and the most damaging arrogance is to misread another country's weather as costume. Pride misjudged climate. In display cases from Moscow's Poklonnaya Hill to Dresden's Military Museum, the winter kit sits in quiet rows, its seams and stitching outlasting the speeches that once dressed it down. Cloth outlives rhetoric. The wind over those old fields still carries a thin sound in deep winter, the faint hiss of snow pushed by nothing you can see, and it is easy to believe that if you stood there long enough you would hear laughter that turns into a cough. Memory chills the throat. History's verdict on the first frost outside Moscow is not that nature chose a side, but that one side chose to master it sooner, and the other learned too slowly that weather is a doctrine. Choice met consequence. And so the joke that started at the edge of a field in September froze in the air by December, caught by breath turned to glass, and fell wordless into the snow. They mocked the Red Army's winter gear until frostbite crippled their advance.